So thanks very much for being here. So you are the CTO and co-founder of MongoDB, which is the most popular NoSQL database, at least as judged by DB engines, which keep track of the things, and the fourth most popular database overall. The company has raised $300 million in capital, most recently in a Series G last year, in January 2015, at a reported $1.6 billion in valuation. The round was led by an unnamed sovereign wealth fund, and also Goldman Sachs, T. Rowe, NES, Sequoia, so plenty of great people. So the last numbers I saw, and that's probably somewhat old, were 2,000 customers and 400 employees. Is that presumably you have?
Grown a bit since then. I don't know if the customer number is sort of public, but the employees are about 550 employees now this year, okay. Growing pretty rapidly.
Okay, which makes you, by far the most successful New York deep tech startup in a very long time. Although I guess you guys are very much bi-coastal now, but you.
So most of our engineering is actually in New York, which is actually sort of the opposite of a lot of other tech companies.
Yeah.
So about 85% of our engineering is based in New York, in Times Square, 10 blocks away from here. But the rest of the company is very spread out across the world. There's a lot of sales, a lot of support, a lot of consulting, and that is very distributed. We've got a big office in Palo Alto, and then a lot of offices all around the world.
Okay, so maybe just to start, and one thing that is a distinguishing characteristic of this event is that it's all about data and data startups, but it's also very much an entrepreneurial event. So we like to hear about people's sort of entrepreneurial stories. I'm curious what's yours. You guys started as 10gen, right, initially, and that was something slightly different.
We started as 10gen, so we started building this thing in the fall of 2007, and we really started building it based off some pain points we had in building our own applications. And if you looked at sort of why we started working on this at all, we were actually going to, we're wrapping up another company, and we're trying to figure out what to do next, and we came up with this idea for this application that was kind of interesting. And we started designing it, and we realized very quickly that we're going to run into database problems and application platform problems, and we're trying to figure out what we really wanted. And the more we worked on it, the more we sort of designed what we were going to build for ourselves, we realized that the platform was actually way more interesting than the application we were going to build, and decided to just sort of not work on the application at all, and just build a platform. And the original 10gen platform was a little bit different. So it was MongoDB, it wasn't called MongoDB then, but it was MongoDB as a database layer, and then a JavaScript-based platform as a service on top of that. So developers would take their JavaScript application, they would give it to us via SSH or Git or something. This is back in 2007. And we would deploy it, we would manage it. So the closest analogy you would have is sort of App Engine. This was before App Engine came out by a few months. And what happened in 2008 is that App Engine came out, and it was, people thought it was very cool, but at the same time, while it was very cool, it was sort of such a massive space to take on, to sort of take the entire ownership of an entire application. We were 8 people at that point, and we realized that this was way too big of a space for us to take on, and decided that the database was the most interesting part of the platform. And so then in February of 2009 was the first version of MongoDB that came out just as MongoDB. We actually sort of cut off the top of the stack right before we were about to launch it, and then just launched the database.
And it's an open source product, right? So how did you start an open source project? How did you get a community to start contributing?
Well, the great thing about open source is that it's almost self-fulfilling. You sort of get it out there, and initially it was really just talking at events like this, blogging as much as we could, talking to our friends, frankly, talking to friends and friends of friends, and just getting them to try it. The nice thing about MongoDB was that it was compelling enough, even in sort of its very first early incarnations, that people sort of saw a promise. Right? It wasn't very good, it didn't have a lot of features, it didn't do very much at that point. But people were really compelled, like, wow, this could actually be really interesting. And so they tried it, and so the word spread very rapidly. And once that happened, being open source, people could download it, try it, play with it. No barriers to entry, so people just got hooked pretty quickly. About 4 months after we launched, SourceForge decided to port their entire platform to MongoDB, which was sort of a crazy move. I mean, this was 2009, so it's been a while. But they ported the entire platform to MongoDB prior to MongoDB 1.0, and that was one of the big instigators of people sort of like, wow, this is pretty interesting. That was actually before the term NoSQL, I believe, by about a month or two.
Interesting. Okay. Well, speaking of NoSQL, so we have a broad audience here. We have a bunch of people who presumably live in Mongo and are technical, and we also have people who are more on the business side. So let's start at a fairly high level. Help us understand what is a NoSQL database, the evolution, how that's different from a SQL database.
So NoSQL database is really sort of one of the words that I don't like to use, because it really doesn't tell you much about what it is. So SQL's been around for a long time. It was designed for some very specific use cases and is incredibly good for those use cases. So NoSQL sort of has become this category of things that aren't that. And there's a lot of different things in that space, and especially over the last 8 years, you've seen a lot of different kinds of things come out and a lot of different people trying different things. So if you think about MongoDB and why MongoDB is interesting to people compared to a relational database, the simplest example I use is a relational database is basically like Microsoft Excel on steroids. If you take Microsoft Excel and you've got tables and rows and you've got columns, and it's kind of like a relational database, but what a relational database does is give you an incredibly powerful platform to work with big Excel spreadsheets in a way that Excel never could. It gives you programmatic APIs to them, it gives you scalability, it gives you all these great things. The problem is that in the real world, trying to model data and putting everything into an Excel spreadsheet is pretty complicated. If you're trying to store information about a person in Excel, it's tough because you've got first name, last name, email address. That works pretty well. But then I want to store my address in Excel. Well, okay, fine. I put like 5 columns there, an address 1, an address 2, a state, city, zip. That's fine. But what if I want to store a work and home address? Now I've got to duplicate those things. What if I want to store all my previous addresses? Maybe I move around a lot. Maybe I've got 10 different addresses. So I'm not going to have 50 columns for addresses. So now I have to have a separate table for that. And it just becomes very cumbersome for people. And the interesting thing with that is if it's cumbersome for people, it's cumbersome for developers for a bunch of different reasons. One, it's just a lot of cognitive load to understand what's going on. And 2 is that programming languages have evolved to make it easier for developers. So programming languages have objects and dictionaries and are structured. And then so now you have these programming languages, and mapping those programming languages back to this sort of Excel-like model is pretty complicated. And what MongoDB does is let you store data in a format that's very similar to programming languages. You have structures, you've got hierarchy, you've got arrays, you've got lists. So you can take your user, everything about a person, and store it in a single document in MongoDB so that it's very easy to understand. And the key thing that we did is, you can always just store everything about a person in a single cell in a relational database. The thing that we did that was interesting was let you actually index on it and search on it and modify it in sort of very small, isolated ways. So if you want to find everyone who has ever lived in New York and is between the ages of 30 and 40, you can put an index on that and make it very quick and make it very efficient and make it very easy.
Great, thank you. So for the more technical people in the audience, last year was a very important year for Mongo in terms of product release. So maybe a few months before that, there was chatter around scalability issues for the database and that type of things. And you guys came out with a very strong 3.0 release. And then a 3.2, and so the 3.0 release, I think, came partly through an acquisition, but it brought document-level concurrency, storage engine API, that type of thing. Do you want to, I guess, put that in context?
Sure. So just to sort of set the stage a little bit. So the storage, if you think about what a storage engine is, the storage engine is sort of the bottom level of the database, sort of how you put stuff on the actual hard drives, how you actually store it. And so when we first built MongoDB, we put a pretty simple storage engine under it, just because we were trying to build something and get it out there and see if people liked the concept. Because when we started building it, it was very unclear if people wanted a document database. There wasn't really anything like this in the market. We were trying to figure out, were we doing anything useful? We were a very small company with not a lot of funding and trying to figure out what we should do. So over time, this storage engine that was very simple clearly was not good enough for the workloads that people were trying to use with MongoDB. So in the summer of 2014, we started trying to figure out how to sort of, get ahead of ourselves. And there was a few different options, one of which was sort of take what we had and just sort of keep making it better. And we put a few people on that, and people were starting to work on that. And the other thing we were looking at is sort of, is there a modern storage engine that is sort of, that we want to sort of, think is the best storage engine out there that we could work with? What we ended up finding was this company called WiredTiger. And WiredTiger was founded by the founders of BerkeleyDB. And for those in the tech space, BerkeleyDB is sort of one of the, it's been around since I think '89, and sort of one of the core storage engines that's built into almost every application or every system you've ever used. And those guys left, it was bought by Oracle eventually, and they left Oracle around 2007 and started WiredTiger with the sole purpose of building the best possible modern storage engine. Turns out all they wanted to do is focus on building a storage engine and not focus on building a company. Turns out we needed a great storage engine and a great storage engine team. So we ended up acquiring them in the fall of 2014, and then that became the storage engine for MongoDB in 3.0 last March. And the nice thing about that was that it was not sort of an incremental improvement. WireTiger was not a little bit better than the previous storage engine. It really was a complete leapfrog. It was 10 times faster, it had compression, it had all these great features. So we were able to completely change sort of what storage engines meant for MongoDB. So that was sort of the big feature in 3.0. And then 3.2 came out in December. And 3.2 had a lot of stuff for enterprises. As we're getting more and more enterprise adoption, things like encryption at rest matters a lot of security features. We've done a lot in sort of the management space. So you can have, a lot of people have fairly large MongoDB deployments where you're not managing 3 servers or 6 servers, where you're managing hundreds of servers. If you want to do things like rolling upgrades of hundreds of servers, you don't want to write scripts to do that. You want a tool that can go through and just do it automatically, that it can worry about the uptime, that it can do sort of all the management for you. And that's, a lot is what we spent last year working on, is sort of the management tooling, making managing large fleets of MongoDB deployments very easy.
And also a connector to BI tools, right? And Tableau.
Right. I mean, you might seem to remember this better than I do. We came up with 2 pretty interesting tools also. One is a BI connector. So again, as a lot of enterprises are usually putting more and more data into MongoDB, connectivity to tools like Tableau and sort of all the other sort of BI tools became more and more important. So in December, we released a BI connector that speaks sort of completely native SQL. So like it actually pretends to be either Postgres or MySQL, and it will let you run, connect Tableau to MongoDB and sort of do your standard analytics without having to do something else. And then we also came out with a tool called Compass. And Compass is kind of interesting because one of the challenges with MongoDB is you've got developers who write an application in MongoDB and hand it off to an ops team. And the ops team doesn't know exactly what's in a MongoDB document. There's no fixed schema, it's a little bit more flexible, so they're handed this thing and they don't quite know what's going on. And Compass gives them a way to sort of look at the data, it does some sampling, it gives them a nice graphical view of like, okay, what is going on here, what are the fields, what kinds of data is on here. They can click around and sort of get a feel for what's going on, and it makes them a lot more comfortable deploying an application with MongoDB.
Okay, great. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the general theme of data platform convergence, which really means it seems that the world, 8 years ago maybe sort of exploded into, the NoSQL world and the SQL world, and within the NoSQL world into all sorts of different, graph databases, document databases, key value stores, like a whole ecosystem there, and it's starting to feel like the worlds are starting to converge again, and I'm curious, maybe starting with the convergence within the NoSQL world. So there was this term that was polyglot persistence, which was this concept of, hey, it's great if you have multiple use cases, then you should use different databases for each one of those use cases. And it seems that people are starting to evolve away from this. Is that how you think about the world as well?
It is. I think it's less of an evolution away from it. I think if you look back 10 years, people were sort of struggling with lots of different problems. And it was very easy and sort of very pragmatic to find a product that solved a problem. Like, I need to scale this service, I need to scale this application, I need to do something. And I don't want to choose a platform for the next 10 years because frankly none of them are ready for that. So just get me a product that solves a problem, gets me out of my current situation. And so that's what people did. So they had their big relational database, that was sort of their standard thing, and they tried some new database in order to sort of solve a problem. As all of these things have matured, as MongoDB has matured, it can solve more and more problems. And no one I ever talk to wants to have 15 different databases in production. It's just not good for anyone. It's not efficient, it's not easy to manage, it's very frustrating for people internally. They don't want to have one, but they want to have a handful of databases. And it really comes down to is how you store the data and what kinds of things you can do with it. And so in MongoDB's case, the thing that, one of the things that I love about the document model is the document model really, in many ways, can be a superset of other data models. If you want to store graphs in MongoDB, you can store them pretty well with arrays. You can't do the algorithms yet, but that's something we're actually working on. So we want to add graph algorithms, and that's coming out in 3.4 later this year, where you can actually go ahead and do some basic graph queries. In 3.2, we added a join operator. We call it $lookup, but it's fundamentally the same thing as a join, to sort of let you do some of the workloads you would take from a relational database. Now, MongoDB is definitely not a good relational database. It's a pretty terrible relational database. But we're moving in that way where you can start taking some of these workloads and putting them more into a few different products. And one of the things we like about MongoDB also is, so that's sort of on the query side and the developer side. The other piece of it is the operational side. And we really want you to be able to configure your way into different use cases rather than having to use different kinds of products. So depending on what levels of consistency you want, what kind of geography you want to be able to support, what kind of durability versus performance you want, we think those things should be configuration options, not product choices. And we strive to sort of let you configure your way into different kinds of use cases as opposed to having to combine multiple products.
Yes, yeah, so I think that's, I mean, you're alluding to this right now. So I guess the second part of that overall data platform convergence, question was precisely the convergence between NoSQL and SQL. So you're starting to see some NoSQL vendors adding SQL or SQL-like support to their databases. So you've seen Cassandra doing their Cassandra query language, Couchbase with their Nico language, and then you've seen Teradata on the sort of SQL world adding JSON support. So you're starting to see this happening, and I'm curious about how you guys are thinking about this.
Yeah, so we see it a fair amount. Personally, I don't find it super interesting. I think the challenge with a lot of these SQL-like languages is they don't really let you use SQL-compliant tools. So you can't use your Tableau directly with it because it doesn't speak sort of standard SQL. And it doesn't quite give you the full expressions you want because SQL doesn't really work for some of the more complex data models. So we're working pretty hard on our query language and making it sort of the best query language for a document-style database. And at the same time, in our BI connector, trying to make a completely standard SQL driver for MongoDB that speaks sort of like very basic SQL, but that lets you get access to that data for your sort of legacy tools or for your BI tools. We have not invested in, we don't really plan on investing in sort of a SQL-like language, because I think SQL by itself is very useful, and then you sort of want the best possible language for developers to work with. And the feedback we get from developers is that using the MongoDB query language is a pretty good experience. It's a language where you can go to the shell, you can type a query, you can get feedback. It's very easy to work with both sort of in an ad hoc fashion or from your program. So we're really doubling down on that.
Okay, and the last part of that convergence is possibly databases and analytics, which sort of happened a little bit in the Hadoop world. Did you see that happening as well?
Yeah, so that we see a lot more of. So we see a lot of people who have data in MongoDB not wanting to put it into a separate analytics database and wanting to do queries on that. A lot of this is really predicated on one, migrating data and synchronizing multiple data stores is complicated and complex, and often you need twice as much hardware, and also the fact that people don't want reporting that's 24 hours delayed. People want reports and analytics that are in real time. And so we do a lot of work to make that work very well. So you can actually have reports in MongoDB, but you can have them hit nodes that are dedicated for analytics so that there's no lag on your production system, but at the same time you're getting real-time results for all of your analytics queries.
Okay. And so one of the struggles for people, and including people presumably in this audience that look at buying some of those technologies, is the number of NoSQL companies out there. There's again been this explosion. Help us. I mean, you can badmouth competitors if you want, but help us understand, like in the most possible sort of objective way, how to think about those different companies, or maybe why you guys are the best in the category.
Yeah, so the database space in the last 10 years has seen to be completely fair, a unbelievably ridiculous number of products. We were joking a couple years ago that basically, anyone who has an interesting database idea can get funded pretty quickly. And then there was a while where, it was very easy to sort of start a database company because there was so much space there. And the database space is a very large space. If you look at Oracle, you combine Oracle's revenue, database revenue, and Microsoft database revenue, and IBM's database revenue as sort of a monstrous space. So it's a very interesting space to go after. And in addition to that, the amount of pain developers have with databases is monumental. I mean, how many developers here, if they think back over the last 15 years, are incredibly happy with their databases? Anyone? It just doesn't happen, right? People are always frustrated with their databases. And many of the people I know who work in databases got into databases because they were frustrated with databases. And that's frankly how I got into it. A lot of sort of my mentors who are database people got into it because of that also, right? There's always some problem they were trying to solve and they couldn't do it because of the database. And they're like, all right, well, I guess I'm gonna be a database guy from now on. So that's kind of a common thing. So a very ripe space, massive amount of competition. I think the key really is sort of getting past and I apologize to the MongoDB marketing people in the crowd, getting past the marketing a little bit and looking at sort of what it can actually do. And frankly, especially now, it's so easy to try these products, download them, look at them, and just try it. And that's where MongoDB really shined in the beginning. I think that's where people get the most benefit from. There's not going to be that many databases you're going to try for a specific project or a specific application. And I'm a big believer in sort of like quick proof of concepts. Download things, try it out, see how it works, see if you like it, talk to your friends. I don't think there's really any other way to do it. And then the question is sort of, are you looking for a product that is specific to like a very specific use case? I want to get the absolute best product to solve one pain point, or do I want to find something that I'm actually going to sort of start using for a lot of products and a lot of projects that I want to sort of like, put a little more weight behind. And there you want to look for things that has sort of a larger feature set that can really sort of scale with the business, that has a company behind it that that's not going to go to business. But at the end of the day, it comes down to trying it. Is it going to make me more productive? Is it going to make it easier for me to do my job? And sort of, can I trust the product and trust the company behind it?
Okay, great. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the business aspect of this and the business of open source. So it seems that Mongo has done an incredible job at conquering the developer crowd. Yep. And the question is always, how do you go from developers to mission critical, enterprise-wide deployments? So where are you guys on that arc, and how do you think about that from a strategic standpoint?
So I certainly think about it a lot. I think a typical way MongoDB moves into enterprises is you get some developer who tries it out for some small application. Maybe it's a logging application or something on the side that if it goes down, it doesn't matter at all. That works well for a little while. He convinces his boss to try it for something a little bit bigger, not quite mission critical, but kind of important. Then it goes into sort of like a tier 2 application that's mission critical, but not the most important. And then if that goes well, then it sort of gets greenlit to go into like a mission critical application. And then if that works well, and then it becomes sort of a standard across an enterprise. Right? That is sort of the very typical way MongoDB enters big companies. And it's obviously very varied, but in a lot of companies we're sort of past that stage where we are sort of the data platform for a lot of mission critical applications. And in other enterprises we're sort of at the very beginning. So it really covers the full gamut. And a lot of it depends on what they need in terms of security features, in terms of like when they started using it. No big company that I know of is ever going to adopt something like MongoDB and day one put it in a mission critical use case. It's just, I wouldn't do it. They shouldn't do it. It just doesn't make sense, right? And not just from a trust standpoint, but from they need people who know how to use it. They need to have trained staff. They need to know, what happens at 3 in the morning if something does go wrong. There's a lot of things that have to happen before that.
Yeah, great. And how do you guys monetize? So I read somewhere that I think actually your CEO Dave mentioned that as of now you monetize about 5%, and the hope is to increase that to 20 to 25%. That's the numbers I read. So how do you do that? What is the strategy? What are the products that enable you to monetize more of the user base?
Yep, so there's probably 3 main strategies for how we monetize MongoDB. So one is sort of very traditional open source. So we sell consulting and support around the basic database, right? So for a lot of mission critical applications, they want to have either help getting it launched or support. So if something goes wrong, they can call us. This is it's a pretty tried and true business model for open source. If you look at Red Hat, this is where most of their revenue comes from. And that's, that's a good business. We're pretty happy with that. Then there's sort of tools. And in the tool space, we look at things that are tools that enterprises really care about, that people in sort of the developer community don't care that much about. So the tools I mentioned before, like the BI connector and Compass, are really tools for enterprises, and those are paid for products. They're not open source products. If you want to use them, you need to talk to us. And that's sort of what gets us to the 5-10% range. In some ways, the big thing and the thing that really is different about now as opposed to 10 years ago is the cloud. So we've got a suite of cloud services that we're pretty excited about, and a bunch of new cloud services coming out later this year that we're even more excited about. And we think sort of cloud is sort of one of the most interesting things to happen to open source in a long time, because it gives people an interesting way to sort of pay for things. I think for a mission critical database, the world is moving very much towards, everyone wants open source for very good reasons. And so it's sort of a hard argument to sort of buy open source. On the other hand, everyone needs someone to run the database, to back up the database, to manage the database, just like they do with, Amazon or the Google or Microsoft clouds. People need people to help them. And if you can sort of pay someone to manage your MongoDB for you or to back up your MongoDB for you, that's a very compelling argument. So we've got a few different products out right now. One is a cloud manager, which lets us manage your MongoDB deployment for you, either in the cloud or frankly not in the cloud, or both, where if you don't want to have to think about upgrades or all those sorts of things, you just sort of let us manage it for you. We connect it to your Amazon account or to your on-prem stuff, and we'll manage it for you. We'll do backups for you, and we'll sort of take care of all the heavy lifting. I think cloud is sort of one of the most interesting things to happen to sort of open source monetization, sort of see where that goes over the next 5 years.
Okay, great. Then last question from me, and then we'll open it up to people. So precisely to this point about the cloud, what do you think about Amazon as a company that has displayed a little bit of a tendency to take open source projects and offer them as a service separately from the host of the company that is behind the open source project? Is that something you guys worry about?
So they do this a lot. So for those who don't know, so for example, Amazon has a product called RDS, which is Relational Database Service. And in that, they have managed MySQL, managed MariaDB, managed Postgres, even managed Oracle, and managed SQL Server. They did this for Elasticsearch a little while ago. So in MongoDB, it's a little different. We've got a slightly different license. It's an open source license. It's a Free Software Foundation approved license, but it's the AGPL. And the AGPL gives us a little bit more advantage than other players. So Amazon can't quite do the same thing that they can with MySQL as they can with, so they can't do the same thing with Mongo as they can do with MySQL. So we're in a little bit in a better position. And that's why we can sort of have these management tools that work with Amazon very carefully, and we sort of integrate with Amazon. So if you want to use Amazon and MongoDB, you can go ahead and go to Cloud Manager today, put in your credentials, and we will just spin stuff up in your Amazon account for you, and we'll manage it for you. But you have to come to us. I think Amazon is moving impressively fast in the cloud space, and I think they're sort of really changing the game there. But I think that what we see is a huge amount of Azure adoption in the last year. We see Google started to come up quite a bit, and it's pretty interesting to sort of see what happens. And a lot of people we talk to want to be cloud agnostic, right? They want to have a service that lets them run wherever they are. So maybe they want to be on Amazon today, but if they wanted to move to Google next year, it would be a pretty easy move. And so I think that Amazon is sort of doing a lot of things, and we sort of work with them quite a bit. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of other interesting stuff happening in the cloud also.
Great, thank you very much. So we have one question here. We have Ty. Do you want to? Oh, if you're closer.
That SourceForge moment 4 months after you launched feels like a big moment for MongoDB, the fact they moved everything over to Mongo, where you guys had just launched. How did you convince them to take that risk on you when you're so new? And were you ever concerned that maybe the platform wasn't ready for a production load at that volume?
So we learned about it from their blog post, and we were very worried that it was not going to work. It was completely. We had no idea. We had not talked to any of them before it launched. We talked to them after the fact a lot, but they just did it completely on their own. It was this guy in Atlanta whose name escapes me at the moment, but he just did the whole thing and convinced everyone to do it, never talked to us, never reached out to us, and just launched it. And at first we were very excited, then we were frightened, and then we were pretty excited after it actually worked for a couple of months.
Thanks.
If you yell, I can probably repeat the questions.
This is recorded for posterity.
Hi. Which of three areas do you think about the most? Competing with features of other NoSQL products like Cassandra, or area number two, helping people migrate from existing SQL, like for mission critical stuff, or the third area of introducing novel features? Which is, how do you adjust your attention to those three different areas?
So I'll change it a little bit. So I think the areas that I focus on a lot. So one is, making current users of MongoDB as successful as possible, which ends up being a little bit of a combination of all those things, right? So it's talking to current users and figuring out, what we can do to make their experiences with MongoDB better. Two is sort of figuring out how to help people who want to migrate to MongoDB but can't because we have we're missing something, and how to let them be able to move over. And three is sort of cloud and those things, and sort of how, where the database space is going, and sort of where we need to do to sort of get ahead of it.
All right. Actually, last question because we're running a little behind.
Okay. Tony Bear with Ovum, and I've had a long admiration for Mongo. And you guys have gone through a very interesting transition over the past year with the 3.0 product, where basically you did a heart transplant, basically, going from an engine which was optimized for developers towards something which is more enterprise-based. I have two questions related to that. One is, since you've come out with 3.0, because you still offer the old engine as an option, how much adoption have you gotten of Wired Tiger?
I don't know if we are sort of releasing numbers, but it's frankly surprisingly high. So in 3.0, which came out in last March, we offered both, and the old option was still the default. So if most people use databases, don't change the defaults. And so we were expecting 5%, and it was quite a bit higher than that. In 3.2 that came out in December, we were confident enough to actually switch the default. So 3.2 defaults to Wired Tiger, and most people are using that with 3.2. Because most people are just going to use what we sort of default to.
And the experience is still the seamless. It still looks like the same engine to the developer using.
Yeah, developers should not be able to tell the difference between whether they're using the old storage engine or Wired Tiger. It should just be faster and be better. Okay. But from a feature standpoint, exactly the same thing.
Okay, final question, which is that you're not going the path of trying to be trying to do SQL or be SQL like the others. What I'm wondering is, given the richness of the document model, which is much richer than a SQL data model, do you expect to see a generation of tools that, like a BI type tools, that will start to query JSON natively? And if so, are you doing anything to basically help build that ecosystem?
So frankly, we would love to. I think that it's not a simple problem, right? Building a graphical tool for relational databases may not be pretty, it may be a little bit cumbersome, but it's straightforward to understand how you might do it. With MongoDB and a rich document model, it's a very hard UI problem. It's not obvious how you would go about solving that problem. So our Compass product actually is probably the closest thing to sort of starting to play with how you visualize these things graphically. It's no way, shape, or form a BI tool at all, but it's just a way to look at MongoDB data graphically. So I really hope there is. In terms of if we're doing anything to foster it, one, yes, with Compass a little bit, and two is, we do push the BI guys all the time to sort of say like, hey, you should do this. You really should do this. We've been doing that for a few years, and they're still saying, yes, we want to, but we don't know how. So I think that will happen over time, but it's not going to happen this year. I think it's going to be a pretty long-term project, but eventually it will happen.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with us, and you'll be around after this for a little bit as well? Okay, awesome. Thank you very much.